If I told you that in the not too distant past, really a short time ago in the grand scale of human history, in a particular region of the world, that maybe as many as 12 million people, maybe more, died in a mass violence event with disease and starvation and torture and destruction and chaos. We're talking about entire villages and communities completely destroyed. We're talking about half of the population of this area disappearing. Again, historically speaking, overnight. A people whose land and wealth were plundered. And if I told you that the reverberations and the ramifications of that mass death event would last for decades and decades into the present, what would you think of? You might think of the Holocaust and related atrocities in World War II. You might think of the horrors of communism, Soviet famines and gulags and atrocities, maybe communist China, maybe the decimation of the original inhabitants of the Americas as a result of colonialism. And those would all be reasonable and common answers, and they would be correct. But I think coming to mind for less people, and coming to mind less often throughout modern history, would be the Belgian Congo. For those who are familiar, the term Belgian Congo itself is two words together that really have become infamous in the study of history. What happened there in the late 1800s and the early 1900s is one of the most harrowing tales in all of history. Greed, corruption, evil, torture, death, disease. Again, a people and a land plundered and ravaged. But it's also a story that is not without resistance and heroism and people trying to fight that age-old struggle that sometimes in history seems like we're on the losing end of. People trying to do the right thing and fight back in their own way. So this is going to be the story of what happened in Central Africa in what we call Congo from 1885 to 1908. The Belgian king Leopold II controlled the territory single-handedly and called it the Congo Free State. But as historian David van Rybrock in one of his books on the topic says, somewhere along the line, the Congo Free State just became the Belgian Congo, as far as what people refer to it as, and it rightly has all of these infamous connotations to it. And we will get to all of that, but there's always a question of where do you start a story? Sometimes you start it at the beginning. The Congo is an ancient place. And I say that because sometimes when people tell this story, they start it with the arrival of Europeans in Africa, or they start it in the 1800s with the beginnings of the scramble for Africa or African imperialism. And while that is ultimately where this particular story is going, I think it's important to establish some of the ancient origins of this place, the Congo, because that history and that background is going to matter in a significant way. And the history of Congo follows what a lot of people would probably call a traditional story of humanity. So hominids or upright apes are walking around 7 million to 2 million years ago. And as evolution is working its magic, we get different versions of what we would call early humans. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and eventually we get Homo sapiens, and they are emerging out of East Africa sometime around maybe 400,000 to 200,000 years ago, maybe 100,000 years ago, depending on which historian or archaeologist or anthropologist you're reading and how old those books are. But historian David van Rybrock thinks that somewhere around 90,000 BC, so roughly 92,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers are migrating from East Africa into this area of West Africa that we now call the Congo. They probably live in groups and they hunt and fish to survive. And they're migratory, so they may have a general base of operations that could be hundreds of miles of square footage. As time goes on, these hunter-gatherers develop things like trade, tools, knowledge of the environment. Van Rybrock says, quote, "They must have possessed a very thorough knowledge of their everyday environment. They hunted apes, antelopes, and porcupines. They picked nuts and fruit, dug for tubers, and knew which plants were medicinal and which were mind-expanding. Even then, there was contact with the outside world. Flint and obsidian were traded over great distances, sometimes up to 300 kilometers away." End quote. By around 2500 BC, we know that slavery was another thing that developed. The kingdoms of Egypt in the north and east of Africa were very interested, especially in a group of nomadic peoples that lived in the rainforest of Congo called the Pygmies. And so as larger states are developing in other places in Africa around 3000 BC or 2000 BC, the Congo still doesn't have larger states as we would think of them, with big governments and militaries and tax collection apparatuses. Agriculture is probably still developing, but by the year 500 AD or 500 CE, we certainly have agriculture. There are these migrations that occur a little bit before this time. They're called the Bantu migrations. Bantu refers to a family of languages, and there are a whole bunch of different peoples and Bantu speakers that generally all practice agriculture, and as they're migrating for a lot of different reasons into different places in Africa, they're spreading their language, but also their agricultural ideas and their tools and these types of things. And these migrations happened over thousands of years. Historian David van Rybrock says, quote, "Slowly but surely, the farming lifestyle spread across Africa. It was the start of the Bantu migration. That migration should not be seen as a great trek on the part of farmers who one day packed their bags and arrived 1,000 kilometers further along with the statement, 'This is it.' It was a slow but steady shift southward. In the course of 3 millennia, agriculture took over all of Central Africa and Southern Africa. The hundreds of languages spoken in that area are, as noted, related even today. The forest in Congo formed no real obstacle for the Bantu-speaking farmers. Along the rivers and elephant trails, they pushed their way into the area. There they came in contact with the local forest dwellers, the Pygmies. By the year 1000, the entire region had been settled." End quote. So we have a hunter-gatherer era at the beginning of human history in the Congo, and we have this slow transition from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, and that transition may be happening at different times in different places, and it might be more of a mix of both rather than just everybody setting down their spears one day and deciding all of a sudden we're going to start farming. But certainly from about 500 AD to 1500 AD, we have this period in Congo where people are starting to settle. We're getting villages, we're getting trade. We don't have written language much, but we do have some interesting ways to communicate. there was something called the bush telegram, where villages could pass information to each other by drumming out codes, and people would hear these drums banging from miles away, and they could send the message further along the chain. For you Lord of the Rings fans, this will kind of sound like the beacons of Minas Tirith. There's iron, there's metal working, and there's a general decentralized political system where these villages often organize themselves around a chief, and sometimes local villages would ally together under the rule of one chief for mutual protection and the advantages that working together might be able to bestow upon you. Now, in the middle 1500s, we get the development of big states, empires. David Van Rybrock highlights the Lunda Empire, the Luba, the Kuba, and the Congo Empire. These were huge states, and Van Rybrock says, quote, "At the top stood a king, a village chieftain to the nth degree, the father of his people, protector and benefactor of his subjects. He cared for the community, consulted the elders, and settled disagreements." End quote. That bit there is going to matter because when the Europeans arrive here very shortly in this story, the personality and the decision-making of the chieftains or the kings in charge of these empires is going to matter a lot as far as how they decide to deal with the Europeans, in particular the Portuguese, during this time. So as the Congo Empire is developing and becoming powerful in the 1500s, there are other things happening in other parts of Africa and other parts of the world that are going to have a big impact on the Congo Empire very soon. I think, first of all, it's important to mention that slavery was absolutely a part of life in these African kingdoms, and in particular, the trading of slaves to be sent along the Indian Ocean slave trade routes. There had been Indian Ocean slave trade for thousands of years by this point. Once the Arab Muslims had taken over parts of the Middle East, they contributed to this slave trade as well, and they became particularly powerful on the east coast of Africa. We call it the Swahili or Arab slave trade. But it's important to mention that the Indian Ocean slave trade differed quite a bit from the transatlantic slave trade, which would come a little bit later in this story. According to author Zainab Badawi, most slaves in the Indian Ocean were women. Sex slaves, concubines for nobles and Arab princes. But there were also male slaves. And this was not chattel slavery, meaning that slaves were not necessarily viewed as property, and they could often be used in a variety of professions. We might think of slaves as simply only being used for heavy labor, which happened, but they were also put to other uses. The children of slave women were born free, which again is unlike the transatlantic trade where a child of a slave became a slave. I think most historians view the Indian Ocean slave trade as a little bit more benign than the transatlantic slave trade. That's not to say it couldn't be brutal and deadly, because it could, and it did. And I want to highlight this now because slavery in the Congo Empire goes from something that is part of everyday life and is part of the system of politics and society that people had grown up in for hundreds and thousands of years. Again, not to say that's a good thing, But as time goes on, the transatlantic slave trade on one side of the Congo and the Indian Ocean slave trade on the other side of the Congo ramps up significantly. And we're going to talk about the transatlantic side of things in a second, but people often forget about the Indian Ocean slave trade here and the Arab Swahili slave trade in East Africa and Central Africa. When that ramps up in the 17 and 1800s, it really impacts the people of the Congo. Zainab Badawi says, quote, "The impact of the Indian Ocean trade was widespread and destructive. Inter-regional trade declined. Traditional systems of networks and alliances were disrupted. Trust between African communities was eroded, conflict and migration increased, farmsteads were abandoned, and internally displaced people carried out raids for food. People sold their children into slavery to survive. Many others simply starved to death." End quote. So that's what's going on the eastern part of the Kingdom of Congo from the 1500s and ramping up into the late 1800s. But on the western side, it was equally devastating, but in a different way. So the first European visitors to the Congo were the Portuguese. They had invented a ship called the caravel, which allowed them to sail into the wind a little bit better, and it was a little more sturdy, and it allowed them to get down to the coast of Africa. The other thing that made it difficult for Europeans to visit the Congo prior to this period was the Congo River. And the Congo River winds its way around Central Africa, and it is really one of the marvels of the world. The Congo River is the second biggest river in the world by volume, after only the Amazon, and it's the most powerful river in Africa by a long shot. It's one of those situations where the river flows so powerfully and so violently that when the river meets the ocean, you can see this phenomenon happening from space. One of the Portuguese guys who comes across it for the first time says, quote, "For the space of 20 leagues, the river preserves its fresh water unbroken by the briny billows which encompass it on every side, as if this noble river had determined to try its strength in pitched battle with the ocean itself, and alone deny it the tribute which all other rivers in the world pay without resistance." End quote. Sailing up this river in the 1500s is just not going to happen. So a lot of what we see with the Portuguese interacting with the Congo is happening along the coast during this period. So in 1491, we get this first expedition of Portuguese men to go meet the king of the Congo. And the Portuguese show this man of Congo, as he was called, the king, guns. And the chief king is happy to accept these guns for his own purposes, and a trade begins to develop. The Portuguese were impressed by the sophistication of the Congo state. They saw jewelry, they saw iron weapons, they saw a civil service system, they saw taxation and currency and agriculture. And as the Portuguese are ingratiating themselves on the west coast of Africa, they also see slavery. So like we've said already, slavery had been in Africa for thousands of years. And becoming a slave in this part of the world was often a result of being a prisoner of war, or having a debt, or being a criminal, or maybe even being given away by family as a dowry. And in a lot of ways, it could be brutal. Slaves could be sacrificed. There was sexual slavery. But like we said earlier, there were some ways where it was a lot different and maybe even more benign than the transatlantic slavery that's going to develop later in this period. Slaves could generally be freed. They could often earn or buy their freedom. And it's not long before the Portuguese really become interested mostly in slavery. Most of these slaves would end up going to the Portuguese holdings in Brazil or other places in the Americas. And again, there is this ramping up process that happens right from the beginning of Portuguese interactions with people in the Congo in the late 1400s, all the way into the 1800s. And over the course of that 350 or 400 year period, about 4 million people go from the Congo across the Atlantic Ocean as slaves. And obviously, this has an extremely disruptive effect on society. So during the key period here at the beginning, the Congo is ruled by a guy named King Afonso. And when he was born, really nobody in the Congo even knew what a European was. Certainly hadn't seen one. And by the time he died, European control was an existential threat to his kingdom. In a lot of ways, he reminds me of another figure that we've covered on this podcast, Moctezuma of the Aztec Empire. He's in a very tough position because Europeans have wealth and power and technology and logistics that they've never seen, and he has to navigate this first contact situation. He has to navigate the trade that's developing. He has to navigate the increase in slavery that's happening as a result of European influence. And he's kind of losing his kingdom and really the soul of his kingdom in real time as it's happening, and he knows it. He is someone who converted to Christianity. He becomes fluent in Portuguese. And this is important because his letters to the King of Portugal are some of the rare treasures of historical documents in that they give us maybe some of the only African perspectives that are written down in this whole story for hundreds of years. The letters indicate that King Afonso very quickly became horrified by the slave trade and the ramping up of the slave trade that happens as a result of European instigation. So Portuguese raiders are kidnapping free subjects and they're sending them into slavery. The goods and the guns and the wealth that the Portuguese are pouring into the Congo are becoming so tempting to African chiefs and local African leaders that Africans themselves are becoming greedy, and they're going on raids where they're trying to gather more slaves so they can sell them to Europeans. And Afonso even loses 10 members of his own extended family. Supposedly, they were to go on a quote-unquote trip to Europe, and they never returned, almost certainly sold into slavery. Listen to Afonso as he writes these letters to the King of Portugal in 1526. And I get these accounts from a book called King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, which is a book I'm going to be citing a lot. So King Afonso says, quote, "Each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and school teachers, and no merchandise, unless it is wine and flour for mass. It is our wish that this kingdom not be a place for the trade or transport of slaves." End quote. In a separate letter to the Portuguese king, Afonso says, quote, "Many of our subjects eagerly lust after Portuguese merchandise that your subjects have brought into our domains. To satisfy this inordinate appetite, they seize many of our black free subjects. They sell them, after having taken these prisoners to the coast secretly or at night. As soon as the captives are in the hands of white men, they are branded with a red-hot iron." End quote. In another letter, he talks about the trade and the goods and merchandise that the Portuguese are offering the Africans and how this is corrupting his people. He says, quote, "These goods exert such a great attraction over simple and ignorant people that they believe in them and forget their belief in God. My lord, a monstrous greed pushes our subjects, even Christians, to seize members of their own families and of ours to do business by selling them as captives." End quote. Portuguese merchants would eventually try to kill King Afonso at least once. He would survive those attacks and eventually die on his own terms, but by the late 1500s, the Kingdom of the Congo was dissolving. And it was the transatlantic slave trade that was the chief cause of this. By the late 1500s, other countries in Europe are getting in on the action, and the Kingdom of the Congo is totally destabilized. Again, you have people allying with European traders, selling free people in their own society to Europeans. You have rival groups who've always been there and maybe never liked the government apparatus of the Congo Empire, and they're willing to ally with European slave traders and gain wealth and guns and prestige. Families are torn apart. People are tortured and chained and dehumanized as part of being a slave, if that needs to be said. From a structural standpoint, the traditional chiefdom political organization that we talked about a little bit earlier, where every village kind of has a chief in charge, and this man at Congo, the emperor or king, kind of views himself as the chief of all of Congo. This is totally disrupted. Now whoever has the most gunpowder is going to be the most powerful, and the traditional structures are less powerful. Economically, things are totally different now. New goods are coming over in the Columbian exchange, and that's increasingly where the value is and where the power is coming from. So traders are making a lot of money off of this, and people who are playing ball with the transatlantic slave trade are fueling themselves and their power more and more. And as the transatlantic slave trade ramps up, again, destabilization in the Congo ramps up. Eventually, there is this sort of climactic battle between forces loyal to the Kingdom of the Congo and the Portuguese win. And by the mid to late 1800s, Europe and European countries are completely in control of this part of Africa. But while it's fair to say that Europeans controlled Africa in the early 1800s or the mid 1800s, they still hadn't ventured too far into the interior. Like we said, the Congo River is tremendously powerful, and the area around the river is rocky and hazardous. Europeans have no immunity to malaria or yellow fever, and the journey up the river is seen as impossible. And many Europeans describe the interior of Africa as the dark continent. Not just for the racial connotations there, but also because this was an area that was relatively unknown to the world. But as we get into the mid 1800s and late 1800s, things change a little bit. Interest in Central Africa becomes more keen, and the era of what we call African imperialism really ramps up. Imperialism basically means one country extending its power and control in a variety of different ways: economically, politically, socially, technologically, ideologically. So extending this power and control over a different place. Some historians call this general time period the scramble for Africa. And there's a lot of reasons that it really explodes in the late 1800s. I think first and foremost, there are economic motivations for imperialism from the European perspective. In Europe, the Industrial Revolution had been cranking out goods and capital, and they needed new markets to sell their goods, to trade with, to promote their global economic interests. And there's also a massive demand for colonies, not just to trade with, but to extract resources from. So Think about all the cash crops that are making a huge difference in the world and that are being harvested from plantations in the Americas. Stuff like sugar, tobacco, coffee, rubber will be added to this, as we're going to see later in the story. These are game-changing products that literally change people's lives. Historian Michael Rutz sums up the economic motivations for European imperialism nicely. He says, quote, observation of industrialized Europe's nearly insatiable demand for colonial cash crops and raw materials, including sugar, tea, coffee, rubber, palm oil, and cotton, during the second half of the 19th century. Established powers like Britain or rising powers like Germany all pursued colonies to exploit natural resources and to prevent their falling into the hands of rivals. Manufacturers also lobbied to make colonies captive markets for their industrial output, frequently undercutting local production as cheap British textiles did to the traditional hand-loom weavers of India. To try to maximize the profitability of new colonies, the colonial powers also often resorted to various forms of coerced labor to produce cash crops for global markets. Dutch colonial administrators in the East Indies forced peasants to plant 1/5 of their land in cash crops, like coffee, that were resold by the state for significant profit. German and Portuguese colonial governments required cotton production in their East African territories, brutally suppressing opposition by indigenous peoples with force. French and British administrations also used forced labor to build colonial infrastructure through labor taxes. In French West Africa, the colonial state required that, quote-unquote, natives provide up to 12 days of labor per year for projects like railroad construction. In the British Gold Coast, mining companies relied on workers recruited by the state, frequently through quota systems that required village chiefs to provide laborers. King Leopold's Congo became notorious for its brutal regime of coerced labor, but the practice was hardly unique to the Congo Free State in colonial Africa. End quote. Okay, that was a long quote there, but it's important because it highlights a lot of the key aspects of European imperialism. First of all, the economic motivations are there. The Industrial Revolution is going on, and the raw economics of it begin to bleed into the political and social realm. So you get competition between these European countries. All of the countries listed in that quotation there are fighting for power and prestige in an era of nationalism, where it became increasingly important from a political perspective to portray your country as greater than everybody else. Maybe a more cynical analyst might say that this is a way to shift attention from the internal division and class struggle that's happening in these countries as a result of the Industrial Revolution and provide an external attention grabber and an external idea that can give people a sense of superiority or opportunity or unity, at least from the government's perspective. And so along with these political motivations, you start to get ideological justifications and motivations for whatever's happening in Africa. So for a certain type of European, this was not about economics. This was about spreading religion, being a humanitarian, civilizing the quote-unquote dark continent. And this ideological justification would become known to history as the civilizing mission, which basically just means the European ideological commitment to thinking that imperialism was not any sort of brutal, coerced labor and violent suppression or anything like that. This was a civilizing mission. We are going to bring religion to the uncivilized, barbaric peoples of Africa. We're going to bring schools, public education. We're going to give these people a chance to take part in global free markets. Again, the Africans are considered uncivilized and primitive. Now, this is obviously going to be a huge theme in our story here, but you really should keep this civilizing mission in mind. And as we get into what's going to start happening in the Belgian Congo, think about that. Think about how many schools do or don't get set up. Think about the public education system that does or doesn't get set up. Think about the civilizing infrastructure that surely the colonial administrators will be setting up in the Belgian Congo so that people can get from place to place. So think about how much quote unquote civilizing is really going on. And I'm going to give you a spoiler right now. When the Belgian colonial system finally collapses at independence in 1960, there are less than 30 African university graduates in the entire Congo. Think about that after 80 years of colonial Belgian control. There are a total of 3 Africans total in the upper levels of the Belgian civil service. And there's essentially 0 human infrastructure. At any rate, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but again, that's a theme. How much of this is really a civilizing operation, and how much of this is racial views disguised as social Darwinism and using power and religion and whatever tools are at your disposal to justify a wealth and power grabbing operation. And so as technology advances towards the end of the 1800s, stuff like quinine for malaria, stuff like rifles and Maxim guns are going to give an even greater edge to European imperialists, and inventions like the steamboat, railroads, and transportation upgrades are going to allow people to begin moving up the Congo River in a way that they couldn't before. Public interest in Africa begins to ramp up. There's always going to be imperial interest in Africa, and now as more opportunities for imperialism are on the table, a king in Europe, the king of tiny Belgium, a guy by the name of Leopold II, is waiting, watching, and biding his time. And finally, he may now have the tools to gain the colony and the wealth and the power that he's always wanted. The story of how he gets that colony, which would eventually be called the Congo Free State and eventually become known as the Belgian Congo, is the subject of our next episode. And author Joseph Conrad summed it up nicely by saying that it was, quote, the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the human conscience. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes, video essays, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways by subscribing and leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for my email newsletter, which has some written pieces and podcast updates every now and then. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. That's it for now.